Hi, my name is Marianne DiMascio, and this is Green Scene. And today we have a special show about Native American issue. And our guest today is David Detmold, who's been working on a resolution in many towns and cities in Massachusetts, and there have been 60 towns and towns and cities that have adopted this resolution so far. And we're involved because Hanson, on their upcoming town meeting, has a resolution. And essentially, the resolution is to support the work of a state commission that would look at reviewing the Massachusetts state seal and flag and coming up with a new suggestion for what it might look like. It's a bipartisan commission. This was formed by Governor Baker in his last term, and it is underway. And the resolution essentially is to support the work of this commission to make sure that it continues. It's been an ongoing issue about this for decades, and we'd like to see it resolved and have a good ending. So let me just ask David to introduce himself for starters. David?
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you for inviting me on to the Green Scene. I live in the town of Montague, out here on the Connecticut River Valley, just a little south of Brattleboro, Vermont, where I have served on the local town meeting for 20 years or so. So I'm familiar with the whole town meeting process about moving from a grassroots perspective, from a local democracy angle, moving an issue like this forward to perhaps be able to influence state policy. And I was the founding editor of a weekly independent newspaper here in Montague called the Montague Reporter. And I have, in recent years, left my post as the editor of that paper and have been working with volunteers throughout the Commonwealth to take a closer look at our state flag and the seal that it is based on, and to actually bring these resolutions forward at annual town meeting, just like in Hanson on next Monday, when this will be discussed and voted on. And as Marianne, you were kind to note, we've already had the 60 successful town meeting and city council votes in favor of changing the current flag and seal of Massachusetts. And so we're very hopeful that Hanson will join that growing list of cities and towns that have weighed in on this topic.
Okay, thanks. That's a great introduction, David. And so this resolution has no bearing on what the actual design would look like. Is that correct? It's not to say we think it should look like this and pass this resolution. It's more like just let's get this process going and have it finalized. Is that right?
The resolution really speaks to the fact that we're hoping that the current symbol, which in one form or another we've lived with since the Puritans arrived, really in 1629, 1630, there has been an image of a native person right in the center of the seal of Massachusetts, with one downward pointed arrow, holding a bow in the other hand, and no quiver on the native person's shoulders. So our Secretary of State's website describes this as an image of a peaceful Indian, so-called peaceful indigenous person. Certainly not an indigenous person armed and ready to do battle, no quiver of arrows. So in the most recent iterations since the Revolutionary War, since about 1780, there's been a sword held in a white hand, positioned right above the head of the indigenous person on our seal and on our flag. And since 1780, there's been a Latin motto underneath that is translated commonly, "She seeks a quiet peace under the sword, but peace with liberty." Combine these basic graphic images of a sword held over the head of a native person with a Latin motto, basically peace under the sword. And you can see why, for decades, native leaders of the area we now call the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and this has been their homeland for 10,000 years before the settlers ever arrived. You can see why indigenous people might say this is a representation of past violence against us. And, there are 90,000 by the latest census indigenous people who call Massachusetts their home today and have called it their home for many centuries before that. But their children go to our public schools, the same public schools our children go to, and have to study this image of a sword over their heads and teach their children. We teach their children that as this is the symbol of our Commonwealth. And for 40 years, our state legislature has had this issue in front of them, brought to them by a very well-known, famous civil rights icon and former African-American legislator from Boston, Byron Rushing, who in 1985, working hand in hand with the former director of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs, Slow Turtle, John Slow Turtle Peters, the former medicine man of the Mashpee Wampanoag, who worked with Byron Rushing to bring a bill to the legislature in 1985 saying, can this symbol possibly be looked at carefully by a special commission that would include Native representation? And having studied it, could that commission perhaps make a recommendation for a more positive image that we could teach our children and uphold to the world as the image of Massachusetts? And it took 32 years of delay before the legislature even would approve a commission to study the situation, to study the flag and seal. And that just happened in January of 2021, that Governor Baker finally, after a nearly unanimous vote in the legislature, agreed, after 3 decades of delay, to set up a commission to study it. So that's pretty much where we're at today.
And now, who's on that commission? I know you mentioned me when we spoke that it was a bipartisan commission.
Yes, as I mentioned, appointed by a Republican governor, and it includes state senators and legislators from both parties, as well as the Secretary of State. The seal of Massachusetts is the particular concern of the Secretary of State. So he has a representative on the commission. There are historians on the commission. There are graphic arts designers, the heads of certain statewide agencies that are involved in tourism and the arts and the humanities. And these appointees are serving, there's a 19-member commission, and they are serving with 6 indigenous leaders. And when I say leaders, I'm talking about the chairman of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the chairwoman of the Akina Wampanoag, the chairwoman of the Herring Pond Wampanoag, who are based right next door in Plymouth, in the Plymouth area. And also there are representatives from the Massachusetts Nation, the tribal nation, and the Nipmuc have a representative on there as well. So here for the very first time, and this is really historic for Massachusetts to do this, state legislators are seated at the table with indigenous leaders looking at the imagery, the native imagery that we have been appropriating for our own state symbol, really without any consultation, any prior consent, or even concern about how Native people might feel about having been represented in this fashion in the center of our coat of arms with a sword over their head for hundreds of years. So this is a historic process. Right?
I know when I think about it, like if it were me or a white person there with a tomahawk over my head. There's,
Mhm.
like it just like flipping it. I can see how,
Mhm.
that not, that sends a message. And I'm happy that this is happening. So if this is
Yep.
happening, why do we need the resolution?
So, like I mentioned, the legislature did not jump at the opportunity to review the state
32
symbol.
years.
Took them more than 3 decades to even put a commission together. And that commission was supposed to make its recommendation back to the legislature. I'll just say this, in October of 21, the year that it was supposed to have been appointed, the governor hadn't even made the appointments until November, the month after the recommendation was
Oh,
due
so
to the
they
legislature.
didn't
They
put
didn't
anyone on
see
the committee till after the committee was due to finish. Right.
to
Okay.
make its report, and they failed to give the commission any funding until 6 weeks before their final deadline ran out in December of last year.
So,
It's
designed
hard
to
to
fail.
conduct statewide polling without any money, to find out what the public at large would like to see for elements in a new seal. And there have been some very creative and wonderful ideas put forth already. And finally, the legislature gave them some money to work with, but no extra time. So there was really a sense that there wasn't a whole lot of um, thought put into how this commission process should move forward. But finally, under the new governor's administration, Governor Healy, just about a month ago, not even a month ago, signed a budget bill, a supplemental budget bill that included extra time, and they do have money now to finish their work. So why are we pushing still at town meeting to make sure the legislature regards this as an important priority? This long stalled racial justice measure of looking at our state symbol. We just feel like it has been the town meetings themselves and the city council votes on this that has really pushed the legislature to make this a priority. And the commission only has the power to make a recommendation. They don't have the power to actually change the flag and the seal. That's going to be up to the legislature. And we hope that if more and more towns say, please get this done, that the legislature will actually finally take action and give us a symbol that we can really be proud of. Everybody who lives in Massachusetts, I think, well, let me speak for myself. I love living here in the Commonwealth. I love the state, and many, many people do appreciate it for its beauty and the beauty of its landscape and all the cultural and educational institutions that we're so fortunate to live here and enjoy. It's just that couldn't we do better about our state symbol that we hold up, not just to the people who live here in Massachusetts as our highest ideals, right? About this is the aspirational image of our Commonwealth, which we also show to the world at large.
Mhm.
We do better, and I think we will, and I think we can, but we have to keep pushing.
Great. I can tell you've been working on this passionately for a while, Dave. Um, and
Yeah.
so two things. One is that you have alluded to the fact that this isn't the first time that it
Yep.
has changed. I think that's important to note, that it's not like it's this seal that was first started with and we're keeping that seal. It's has evolved over the years.
Yep.
That
Yes,
is
that's true. Uh, we often look at the original seal, and I hope the audience watching right now can take a look at that as well. That the Puritans brought over in 1629. And there you can see, when you look at that original seal of Massachusetts, it was the Massachusetts Bay Company seal for more than 50 years. Right there is the native person with one downward pointed arrow, no quiver. And in the original, there's a speech balloon depicted coming out of the native person's mouth, saying, "Come over and help us," which
amazing. Oh, they were doing pretty well before we got
they were
here, right?
doing, they had
Not
their
so well
own, they
once
had
we arrived.
they had their own cultural lifestyle, lands that they cared for, religion, society for many thousands of years, and were doing just fine until the Europeans showed up and suddenly dispossessed them, not suddenly, but very shortly thereafter, of their lands
Yeah.
and often of their liberty, because Native people were indentured into involuntary servitude in colonial households, particularly in Boston and Providence, and they were enslaved and shipped from these shores to the West Indies in particular, to work in the sugar cane plantations, and those terrible treadmills making rum in Barbados and places like that for profit for the colonials. But their death toll in that process was tremendously high, and their families were broken up. And so, did we really come over and help them? Many would say that the reverse is true, and that there is a sort of reckoning due as to the truth of our history, which Indigenous people feel, this is part of that. Looking at the state symbol and the sword over the head of a Native person, and maybe repairing our relationship a little bit, just a little bit, by doing what has been asked and changing this
Mhm.
offensive symbol of past violence.
Yeah. Thanks. And I
Yeah.
hope we do this in Hanson. Hanson is close to Plymouth. We have Native history here. There's the Indian Crossway and the Burge near in Hanson, but part of Burge Wildlife Management land where Native Americans crossed this land. It was a main thoroughfare. So I think it's important to note that there was a significant Native history here in these lands. So,
And
so
when
oh,
and just did we not learn as I went door to door yesterday, handing out flyers in Hanson about this issue, because it's coming to a vote in just a week, and ran into one person who said that Native families have lived up until very recently, and perhaps still, here in Hanson and also in the neighboring town, Whitman. I mean, Native people live in our area
okay.
still today. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was reading about some of the history last night of Russell Gardner, who was had a key role, and he was an historian in some fascinating articles about some of the history, and there's still his children and grandchildren around here. So,
Wow.
yes, really fascinating. Okay, what else could you tell us about the current seal that is? I know there's some other
Mm-hmm.
pieces to the current seal that are you've
Objectionable.
yes, objectionable. That's the word I was looking for.
To put it mildly, so when you take a look not at the original seal, as we've talked about, but how it's evolved over time, and there have been many changes to the seal. There was a whole period of time when the King of England had revoked the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and so that seal was no longer in force as the Massachusetts symbol. And there were seals for royal governors right up until the Revolutionary War, at which point the Revolutionary Governor John Hancock asked none other than Paul Revere to design a seal for the revolutionary government in Boston, the American effort to overthrow the King of England was depicted as a seal for 5 years that Paul Revere came up with, of a Minuteman holding a sword and a copy of the Magna Carta in his other hand. Magna Carta being, the document where the principle of no taxation without representation was first enunciated. So that was a very appropriate, perhaps, for its day image of the Massachusetts seal. And yet, almost directly thereafter, even before the Revolutionary War had ended, we wound up with reverting to the 1629 imagery of a Native person right in the center of this seal. And it's been like that in one form or another ever since. Currently, since 1895, when the legislature actually passed a law saying, here's exactly how the symbol is going to appear until this law changes. We hope that day comes soon. And still today, we have a Native person with one downward arrow and a bow in his hand, but no quiver. And the imagery today features the facial features of a Chippewa chief from Montana, who the illustrator, the illustrator called this photograph of a Chippewa chief, not from Massachusetts, a fine, quote unquote, fine specimen of an Indian, okay, and used those facial features for the Massachusetts symbol. They used a bow. Actually, they copied the bow of a native person who had been shot and killed by a settler in 1665 in the town of Sudbury. And the way history goes, we're no longer aware of what the name of the native person who carried the bow was, but we know the name, for example, of the settler who shot and killed him, William Goodnow. So we're looking at the bow of a slain native person from Sudbury. The illustrator used the skeleton of a native person from Winthrop to make sure that he had the actual bodily proportions correct, as if native people's body structure is somehow distinctly different from white people's. And it, again, another offensive example of how, in a sense, various body parts or skeletons were used to put this symbol together. This is so offensive to Native people when these elements are looked at individually and as a whole. The belt on the tying the robe of the Native person or cloak of the Native person is modeled after the red flannel belt that's kept in the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, and that is thought to have been the belt worn in battle by King Philip, so-called, whose real name was Metacom, the second son of the Massasoit Usamiquan. Okay, so this is the belt of King Philip, and the sword itself above the head of the native person was modeled after the sword carried by Miles Standish, who was the military commander for the Pilgrim colony, and who used his sword against Native people, and Native people remember that particular sword. So you put all these various aspects together, and what you really have is you could hardly design an image that would be more offensive to Indigenous people, and really to all of us who care about racial justice and a sense of fairly reckoning with our history and coming to some terms with, in the present day, our relationship with the Native people of this land, who, really, from a green perspective, as this show is titled, Native people have cared for this land and stewarded this land for so many thousands of years before we arrived. And we're in such a crisis now with the climate and with the extinction of species that is expected to be happening and is happening. Mm-hmm. Would it not be wise for all of us to enter into a more respectful relationship with Native people and appeal to them and their wisdom and knowledge of the land to find a better way to live together, not only with each other, but with the land itself? So I think removing this offensive symbol and listening to Native people in that process of consultation that the Special Commission is engaged in is really a necessary step for us right now as our society matures and reckons with the environmental destruction that we have wreaked upon this land.
That sums it up, David. Well, you pulled all those pieces together. I had that in my mind, but you did it for me. Thank you. So, anything else that you would like to say about this topic that we have?
I would just say that sometimes people at town meeting, over the 4 or 5 years that we've brought this issue to town meeting, in towns like all the towns on the Outer Cape have voted on this. Falmouth just voted on it. Towns like Bolton and Harvard, Lunenburg, Heartland, Worcester County, center of the traditional Nipmuc territory, and some would say quite conservative towns, based on their voting record, have looked at this and voted for it, even over objections that, why are we doing this? This is not a town issue. The state should take care of this. In fact, there's a commission looking at it. Why are you taking up our time at town meeting? And I would turn that around and say, this is the first time in 140 years the state's really taken a careful look at its symbol to see whether it meets our ideals of peace, justice, equality, the continuing benefits of education that our Commonwealth is known for. And this process touches each and every town and city. The town of Hanson, for example, doesn't have a choice. State law requires that this symbol be flown in our public schools and our public buildings. And we do have a voice, however, in each town and city, because this issue affects us. When you begin to see the flag and seal, which is just about everywhere in our Commonwealth, it's on bridge abutments, it flies in front of the state police barracks, it's on the side of all the state patrol cars, it's on the dais behind the judge of every courtroom, it's flying in front of Walmart, for example. Many other commercial stores display the state flag. And Native people who go to our state colleges and work hard studying, get a degree, 4 years later, come home with a diploma that they're supposed to hang on their wall with pride to memorialize their achievement educationally. And right there is a sword hanging over the head, stamped on their diploma. And you know, when you really think about it from the point of view of how this impacts all of us, but Native people in particular, I think a town meeting at this point weighing in and saying, yes, I believe we can do better. We need to support the work of the special commission, and we need to ask our legislators, you know, to make this a priority and finally, after 40 years of delay, give us a new flag and seal we can all be proud of. So I hope, once again, finally, my last word, I hope the voters of town meeting in Hanson will think about this carefully and see fit to join with so many other cities and towns who have called on the legislature to get this done.
Well, thank you, David. You have just given a great overview and a lot to think about. And I think just very thoughtfully done and well researched. You know, you can tell that you've been doing this for a while and have some good information for all of us. So thank you very much, David. And that's the end of this issue of Queen's Team.